Welcome to the November in-service of the Northwest Kidney Center with a special acknowledgement to the staff of the Kent unit where miracles happen every day at the hands of those who work there. Today we're going to talk about salt or sodium and the importance of restricting its intake in dialysis patients in order to avoid complications such as volume overload and hypertension. This talk has four objectives. First, we'll review the history of salt and its impact on the development of civilization. Second, we'll appreciate the clinical consequences of sodium excess in dialysis patients. Three, review the current methods to reduce sodium levels in dialysis patients. And finally, recognize pitfalls that can raise sodium levels in our population. Let's begin our discussion today by visiting Mount Elgin National Park on the Kenya-Uganda border. Here, elephants seek out natural mineral deposits of salt, such as rocks and soil, to supplement their dietary intake of sodium, as their usual diet of woody plants and natural waters is insufficient to meet their needs. In Mount Elgin National Park, on the Kent-Uganda border, elephants have learned to quarry sodium-rich rocks out of the base of a 24 million years old extinct volcano called Mount Elgin. The elephants prefer to stay in the lower slopes where there are a number of caves and the salt is abundant. And these caves are big, up to like 150 meters long, 60 meters wide, some are 10 meters high. And there's evidence that these caves have artificially expanded by thousands of years of mining, not by humans, but by elephants. So the elephants use their tusks to break off pieces of the cave wall, which they then chew and swallow, and that, of course, enlarges the caves and leaves scratch marks all over the walls. And they consume really large amounts of salt in this process. So on average, researchers estimate that a single elephant in one day can excavate about a 2-liter volume of rocks from the cave and eat it. Of course, it's not just elephants and humans that need salt. All life on this earth depends on the chemical properties of sodium to survive. In humans, sodium is an essential mineral that performs multiple functions. It helps regulate blood volume, blood pressure, osmotic equilibrium, and also the pH or the acidity of the blood. Sodium is a chemical element with the symbol Na from the Latin word natrium, has an atomic number of 11. It is a soft, silvery white, highly reactive metal. It's the sixth most abundant element in the Earth's crust. It exists in numerous minerals. It's highly water soluble and it's leached by water from the Earth's minerals over eons in the oceans. That's why there's so much salt in salt water. And the Earth's crust is composed of about 2.27% of sodium. So it's the seventh most abundant element on Earth, and it's the fifth most abundant metal behind aluminum, iron, calcium, and magnesium. So we've known about sodium for millennia, although it wasn't until 1807 that the metal itself was actually isolated by a Sir Humphrey David through electrolysis of sodium hydroxide. And in 1809, the German physicist and chemist Ludwig Wilhelm Gilbert proposed the names neutronium for Humphrey David's sodium. So that's where the symbol Na comes from. There have been many books written on the history of sodium and its importance to the development of civilization. So humans have long recognized the important value of salt. For thousands of years, it's been one of the most important commodities that's been exchanged around the world. And it's been used by humans for many purposes, from food preservation to seasoning to medicine. Food preservation was a very important contributor to the development of modern civilization. Basically, it helped eliminate the dependence of travelers on seasonal availability of food. So it made it much easier to travel and transport food over long distances. Medically, sodium has been appreciated for thousands of years. Hippocrates, for example, encouraged his fellow healers to use salt water to heal various ailments by immersing their patients in seawater. In medieval Europe, a compound of sodium with the Latin name of sodium was used as a headache remedy. In fact, the name sodium is thought to have originated from the Arabic word suda, which means headache. So people thousands of years ago recognized the potential headache-alleviating properties of sodium carbonate or soda. In 1753, the English author and physician Richard Russell published a book called The Uses of Seawater, in which he declared that salt was a common defense against the corruption of bodies and contributes greatly to all cures. Salt was incredibly important to the ancient world. There's archaeologic evidence that humans have been mining salt for over 8,000 years. The first systematic exposition of the different kinds of salt and their uses and how they were extracted was published in China around 2700 BC. And clearly salt had a very high value among ancient peoples, the Jews, the Greeks, the Tamils, Chinese, Hittites, and other people of antiquity. There's a town called Solnitsad. It's the earliest known town in Europe, and it was built around a salt production facility. It's located in present-day Bulgaria, and archaeologists suspect that it acquired its wealth by supplying salt throughout the Balkans. In the earlier years of the Roman Republic, with the growth of the city of Rome, Rome's roads were built specifically to make the transportation of salt to the capital easier. In fact, the Roman word salary comes from the Latin word for salt. It's a salarium. So the Roman soldiers were given a salarium, which I think basically had intrinsic value, is tied to salt, but could be used for purchasing other things. In fact, during the late Roman era and throughout the Middle Ages, salt was a precious commodity carried across the roads, not only throughout Rome, but through all of Europe to the Germanic tribes, for example. And salt in Chinese history, both a driver of technological development and a stable source of revenue for the imperial government. Salt has played a prominent role in determining the power and location of some of the world's great cities. So for example, this picture here to the right is a picture of a city in Austria called Salzburg, or S-A-L-Z. Salz is the German word for salt, so the city of salt basically makes reference to its mines. But there are a whole bunch of cities in Europe that grew to prominence because of the salt trade. For example, Liverpool in England or Munich in Germany. In American history, salt was important during the wars. So, for example, in the Revolutionary War, loyalists, those loyal to the English crown, tried to intercept Patriot salt shipments so that they could interfere with their ability to preserve food. And during the War of 1812, the federal government was so poor that they paid American soldiers in salt. Lewis and Clark, of course, had that famous journey out into the Louisiana Territory, and part of their justification to Congress to allow them to do that was an address that President Jefferson gave to Congress in which he mentioned a rumor of a mountain of salt somewhere near the Missouri, 180 miles long, 45 miles wide, basically, which would have been of inconceivable value to the federal government back then to justify their expedition. Salt comes from two main sources, either seawater or something called rock salt. Rock salt basically is crystallized salt that can be found in sedimentary materials that result essentially from the drying up of lakes and seas. And salt can be extracted from them either by mining, so you can dig it out with a backhoe or a pick, or you can use a solution. Basically, you can pump in water into one of these mineral caves, and that leaches the salt out of the rock, and it produces something called brine. Then you can let the water evaporate, and that leaves behind the salt crystals. Okay, let's turn our attention to salt and its associated physiology. So most humans get salt in their diet in the form of something called sodium chloride. And basically sodium chloride is used as a preservative in food. So like pickles and jerky and other foods like that have a lot of sodium chloride in it. But, a lot of foods out there also have other food additives that have salt. For example, baking soda is sodium bicarbonate, or MSG is monosodium glutamate, sodium saccharin. I mean, basically, various forms of sodium are added to food for all sorts of reasons, not just preservation. In general, we only need about 500 milligrams of sodium per day for those above the age of 10. So we need very little salt to function properly. The upper limit of recommended intake is about 2.3 grams of sodium per day. If you include the weight of chloride in that, that's about 6 grams of sodium chloride. But the average person in the U.S. has about 9 grams of sodium chloride in their diet. High sodium consumption is just not good for you. It's associated with all sorts of health problems, the development of kidney disease, high blood pressure, cardiovascular disease, stroke, heart failure, among other problems. Several studies have demonstrated an association between high sodium intake and higher blood pressure. So, for example, one study showed or estimated that by limiting your sodium intake to 2 grams per day, you tend to lower your systolic blood pressure by about 2 to 4 millimeters of mercury. Doesn't seem like a lot, but just that amount of lowering blood pressure would lead to between 9 and 17% fewer cases of hypertension in this country. And hypertension is probably the biggest risk factor we have for cardiovascular disease. It's estimated to cause 7.6 million premature deaths worldwide each year. If sodium excess is a big problem in the general population, among whom kidney function is normal, you can imagine that sodium excess in dialysis patients who have an inability to excrete the sodium in the form of urine is a huge problem. So the amount of sodium that you have in your body, or the total body sodium, it's really a critical determinant to something called your extracellular volume. How much fluid you have outside of the cells, particularly in your plasma volume, so the amount of fluid inside of the blood vessels. If you have too much fluid inside of your blood vessels, basically you've got too much salt and water inside of a fixed space, it increases the pressure inside of that blood vessels. And that's why dialysis patients have hypertension if they have too much fluid in their blood vessels. And then volume overload in turn is bad for the heart, basically causes a rise in the cardiac output, causes the blood vessels to try to vasoconstrict, so increases systemic vascular resistance, basically all sort of deleterious responses to having high blood pressure. We know that if we reduce the intravascular volume, we can improve blood pressure. And so this is why we try to remove fluid in dialysis patients and why volume overload is such a common problem among dialysis patients. This is one of the studies that has demonstrated the high prevalence of the problem of volume overload in the ESRD population. It's a prospective study published in 2010 that looked at close to 200,000 prevalent hemodialysis patients followed for 2.5 years. What they found was that 14% of those patients required at least one hospitalization or more for fluid overload complicated by heart failure and fluid in the lungs called pulmonary edema, for which urgent dialysis needed to be performed. So very common problem. Another study by Plantiga published in 2018 also illustrated the problem of recurrent volume overload among dialysis patients. It was an observational study of over 200,000 U.S. hemodialysis patients. What they found was that among patients who were hospitalized, 23% of them were rehospitalized within a 30-day period, and almost half of those, so 44%, was for pulmonary edema or fluid on the lungs. This is a chest x-ray, which basically shows pulmonary edema. Normally the lungs should look black on x-ray, but the fact that it's so white and hazy, all of that is what fluid looks like on x-ray. Another study published by McLaughlin in 2012 was basically a post hoc analysis of a very important study called the HEMO study. It was published in 2002. Basically, it was designed to look at the impact of dialysis adequacy on survival. Basically, they instead looked at the sodium intake of subjects, and what they found was that the more sodium the higher mortality you had. So dialysis patients who ingested more than 10 grams of sodium chloride exhibited a significantly higher cardiovascular mortality than patients who consumed less than that. All right, let's now talk about the consequences of excess sodium intake in dialysis patients. So we know that high sodium intake in the long run increases cardiovascular mortality, but there are also some short-term clinical consequences associated with sodium excess. They include hypertension, intradialytic hypotension, and frequent muscle cramps. Hypertension can be difficult to manage in patients who consume a lot of salt. As I said earlier, that drives water intake, and if you have too much water and salt inside of your blood vessels, it increases the pressure inside of a fixed space. Then the nephrologist prescribes an antihypertensive, which the patient may not actually need. And then during dialysis, the combination of antihypertensive medication plus fluid removal oftentimes results in intradialytic hypotension, so the blood pressure falls too much, and then we have to stop taking off fluid, and that may result in a failure to achieve the target dry weight. It's also difficult to control blood pressure if we only dialyze people for 4 hours because there's only so much fluid that you can remove during a 4-hour window. We remove fluid from the intravascular space in hopes that the fluid from the interstitial and intracellular spaces then goes in to replace what we remove, but that process takes time. And again, when we try to take off large amounts of fluid, there are clinical consequences. These complications include hypotension and muscle cramps, both of which are very familiar to all of you. They're common during dialysis, especially if the session time is short and the ultrafiltration rate is high. So patients have more hypotension when we try to remove more fluid during dialysis. They feel bad with dialysis, particularly during the last hour. And what happens then? Well, then patients ask for a shorter dialysis session. They all say, oh, I do great for the first 3 hours. The last hour is just horrible for me. But if we reduce the dialysis duration, then we would remove the same amount of fluid in a shorter period of time, which would necessitate a higher ultrafiltration rate, which would lead to more cramping and more intradialytic hypotension. So then what? Well, then the staff reduce the ultrafiltration rate or give saline, in either case making it harder to achieve the prescribed dry weight, and we end up chasing our tails. So what tools or strategies do we have to reduce sodium burden in dialysis patients? The 3Ds. We can prescribe a low salt diet. We can prescribe diuretics, which enhance urine production, help get rid of sodium. And we can use a dialysate that is low in sodium. So diet, diuretics, and dialysate that's low in sodium. Reducing the consumption of salt is one of the most important things we can do to eliminate sodium excess in our dialysis patients. Now, we also tell our patients to restrict their fluid to about 1 liter per day. Of these two recommendations, which is more important? This question was addressed by a study done by Belding Scribner, the founder of modern dialysis, and Suhail Ahmad, our former chief medical officer at the Northwest Kidney Center, in which they looked at the impact of just restricting sodium in the diet to restricting both sodium and water. In other words, they compared dietary sodium restriction alone with dietary sodium and fluid restriction. So in the first group, the researchers told patients to just restrict the amount of sodium in their diet, very strict sodium intake of 1 gram per day, but they were told not to limit their fluid intake and to drink when thirsty. In the other group, they were told to limit their sodium to 1 gram per day, plus restrict the amount of fluid that they drink. And what the researchers found was that those that only had one set of instructions, just limit the amount of salt, they actually drank less than the group that was told to limit both salt and water. So why is this? Well, it's not entirely clear, but I think sometimes we overwhelm our patients. We tell them to do too much. We say restrict your salt, restrict your phosphorus, restrict your potassium, restrict your fluid intake, and after a while I think they just throw up their hands and say, I'm not going to do any of this. But if you give them very, very clear instructions, I just want you to focus on one thing, limit your salt intake, that I think is a lot more manageable of a problem for them than trying to restrict many things. Another important tool to limiting the amount of sodium in our dialysis patients is to dialyze them using a low dialysate sodium concentration. So at the Northwest Kidney Center, we have a default setting on our machines where we dialyze patients with a sodium concentration of 135 millimoles per liter in the dialysate. So that's usually lower than the concentration of sodium in the blood, and so sodium moves from the blood into the dialysate. But let's say we dialyze them with a sodium of 140 millimoles per liter. Well, then sodium might actually diffuse into the patient over the course of the treatment. That is, patients could end up with more sodium in their body at the end of dialysis than at the beginning. That would leave them with a high dialysate sodium concentration. It would make them thirsty, and then they would drink more fluid. One study published by Davenport in 2008 looked at over 2,000 hemodialysis patients who were dialyzed either on a sodium dialysate concentration greater than 140 versus 136. What they found was those who were dialyzed with a high dialysate sodium concentration had higher intradialytic weight gain, so they drank more fluid. They had higher blood pressure, and they also had more symptomatic hypotension than those who were dialyzed with a lower dialysate concentration. The third tool we have to reduce sodium and water accumulation in a dialysis patient is diuretics. So it's important for nephrologists to remember that prescribing diuretics can help this problem. Specifically, the use of diuretics is associated with less fluid accumulation in between dialysis treatments, lower potassium, less intradialytic hypotension or low blood pressure during the dialysis treatments. Diuretics promote urine production, so better preservation of residual renal function. The use of diuretics is associated with a lower relative risk of cardiac death and a trend towards a reduced risk of all-cause mortality. That said, over time, dialysis patients tend to make less urine anyway, and so you can see here that when patients have been on dialysis for more than 2 years, only about 10% of patients are still receiving diuretics, which is probably an underutilization of diuretic treatment. All right, let's talk about some of the pitfalls that can raise sodium levels in dialysis patients. Okay, so it's very important that we encourage our patients to complete their prescribed dialysis duration. Of course, all of you know this, but just by way of review, if a patient doesn't finish their run, then he or she doesn't remove as much fluid as was intended, then it's harder to achieve the dry weight, and that only sets them up for failure the next run. So it's a harder subsequent treatment if they don't complete their treatment on that day. It's important for nephrologists to remember not to reflexively prescribe antihypertensives when a patient has an elevated blood pressure, but instead focus on the root cause of the problem, which about 90% of the time is volume overload. So first correct the volume overload before you prescribe antihypertensives, because the combination of fluid removal and antihypertensive use tends to increase the chance of intradialytic hypotension, which makes it harder to achieve the prescribed dry weight. Also, it's very easy for us to overwhelm our patients by giving them too many dietary recommendations. Keep it really simple for them. Focus on sodium rather than fluid and sodium. Remember that sodium is what stimulates thirst, and so that's the root cause of the problem, and that's why it's probably more effective than focusing on fluid. Finally, it's important that we avoid something called sodium modeling. In sodium modeling, we vary the sodium during the course of treatment. Specifically, it starts out high and then it decreases over the course of the run. The idea is that high dialysate sodium initially causes sodium to go into the patient, and in theory, this helps draw fluid from the interstitium, so from the tissues and from the cells into the intravascular space, so into the blood vessels. That in theory makes it easier to remove fluid, minimizes the chance of having low blood pressure during dialysis, and in theory would prevent cramps. It also counteracts a fall in urea early in the course of the treatment, and again, in theory, is supposed to make the run more tolerable. This graph demonstrates the sodium concentration with sodium modeling. It starts out high, say at 145 millimoles per liter, ends up low, say at 135 millimoles per liter, and the orange line represents the sodium concentration in blood. So whenever the yellow line is above the orange line, we are giving the patient sodium. So sodium is diffusing into the patient. And it's not till the final third of the run where we're actually removing some of that sodium that we gave the patient. So yeah, you can imagine if you're giving someone sodium during the treatment, it's like giving them saline, and so they have less hypotension, particularly at the start of the treatment. But the problem is that it can lead to net sodium retention, particularly if the patient ends the dialysis session early. So unless they complete their treatment, we will give them more sodium than we remove during that treatment. It doesn't take long for the patient to have way too much salt, drink water, and then develop complications of volume overload. So this is why we don't do sodium modeling. And that brings us to our conclusion. So let's review the highlights. First, remember that sodium is historically important and has shaped the development of civilization in our world. In the medical world, sodium excess causes most hypertension, volume overload, and increased cardiovascular complications in dialysis patients. The strategies we have available to us to reduce the sodium burden in dialysis patients include dietary sodium restriction, again, focus on sodium intake, not water, reduce the dialysate sodium, encourage the nephrologist or remind the nephrologist that diuretics may be helpful, and of course, encourage the completion of treatments. Okay, time for a monthly quiz. I hope you all were paying attention. Question number 1. The consumption of 9 grams of sodium chloride stimulates how much water consumption? That's right, 1 liter of water. So if you eat a lot of salt, that will drive you to consume enough water to lower your sodium concentration of the blood back to baseline. Question number 2. Name 2 ways to reduce total body salt in dialysis patients. That's right. The 3 Ds, diet, diuretics, and dialysate sodium low. So diet, diuretics, and low dialysate sodium concentrations. Question number 3. What are consequences of sodium retention in dialysis patients? You got it. So hypertension because of the expansion of the intravascular volume, interdialytic hypotension because we have to dialyze them using a high ultrafiltration rate. We remove fluid too fast, and it reduces the intravascular volume too quickly, leading to hypotension. And finally, muscle cramps, basically because we are irritating the nerves and the muscles as a consequence of the high rate of sodium and fluid removal. Question number 4. Why is salt so important to civilization, particularly historically? That's right. So it's important for the preservation of food, for the taste of food, and also medicinal benefit. And the 5th and final question, why do we generally avoid sodium modeling in our dialysis patients? That's exactly right. There's a potential for leaving a patient with a sodium balancer, positive sodium balance or sodium retention, particularly if the patient ends the dialysis session early. So if you remember nothing else from my talk today, just eat less salt, tell our patients to eat less salt, And most important of all, thank you so much for everything you do for all of our patients, for making dialysis, high quality dialysis possible for them. Blessings to all of you as we enter the holiday season. This is Andy Borkenbrough signing out until next month.